Okay, thank you so much for joining us today for the AIAA Los Angeles Las Vegas section, the section meeting today. Today we have a very exciting program, and you will enjoy a lot. And for folks online, if you want to ask any question, which is highly encouraged for better interaction, please just let us know online. Click raise hand or just in the chat so you like to speak out. We'll enable your microphone so you can speak out and ask your question. Before we started, we have a few logistic issues, information. So for folks here online, the restroom is, you can see here, there's on your left hand there, you can see the restroom. And we have coffee near the sink. We have cookie, bottled water on the back and check-in table. And also, if you haven't picked up your badge, please do so and sign in. And just a couple of words, because since Andy is also our member of AIAA, I want to mention something about the membership, which is very important. And hopefully folks here who are not member yet will be interested in joining. So AIAA has different kind of, it's a nonprofit organization, professionals like Andy. And so we also have like a high school free membership. So you can go to aiaa.org/HS, and we have different level of membership. So on the back, you can see our membership brochure. Then we have like, student professional program and discount 50% off for if you are a young professional under 35 years old, but above college. With high school student membership free and K-12 educator membership also free. And we got pretty good sign up recently. If you forgot to renew, please do so. And we have quite a couple new sign up join the membership. So we have a very good career resources online, and we also have a brochure here. So please take a look. And it's like a great family in aerospace, so help each other. So please consider it. And we also have the thing here. The paper plane is good for design, build, and apply. It's not the real one, but it's for AIAA promotion. And we also, if you join the member, you'll receive the free magazine, Aerospace America. It's also online. It's a very wonderful magazine with all a lot of insider story. So please look into our membership, and then you can see just like our great member here, like Dr. Andy Klesh. And our speaker today, Dr. Andy Klesh, is a JPL engineer, and he's been working on a very exciting program. You read his bio, so I don't want to repeat again, and Andy can tell you a lot more exciting thing about his life. But the main thing is, can I talk about this? You actually a qualified astronaut. This,
I interviewed for it.
Yeah, he interviewed. Certain things he cannot talk about, but this is okay. He went for interview for become a NASA astronaut. So it's kind of interesting. So he's not just a scientist engineer, but he's actually also astronaut candidate, right?
Not yet.
Interviewee. Okay, very good. So it's a great pleasure and a great excitement. So let's welcome Dr. Andy Klesh for a great today presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all who are here in person or available online. I'm honored to be back here with AIAA and the Los Vegas section on here and giving one of these talks. About a year ago, we got together and talked about small spacecraft exploring the solar system here. And as part of that conversation, brought up some of the other activities that I do work on. I've been lucky enough throughout my career that not only am I working on spacecraft that are exploring out to Mars and Moon and other places of interest in the solar system, but I work on vehicles that dive deep into the ocean, explore Arctic and Antarctic ice, and help us to broaden our capability for exploration. Today, I'd like to dive into that a little bit more and speak to why I believe the oceans are such an important resource for us, not only for exploration purposes, but also so that we can learn and improve our ability to explore the solar system itself on there. It's often been said that we know our moon better than 90% of our oceans here on Earth. And together with Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, we aim to change that.
On this expedition, we're testing a platform with new technology and new designs that will one day go down to the deepest part of our Earth's ocean. There's dangers to it, there's risks sending a vehicle down that deep, and that makes it really exciting. Our goal is to create a vehicle that can easily explore the deepest parts of the ocean.
I've always been interested in exploration and the unexplored areas of Earth and the solar system. We have to be able to do this sort of exploration on Earth before we start thinking about how we might do it on the ocean worlds of the solar system.
The Hadal Zone is from 6,000 meters to 11,000 meters depth in our ocean. The pressure is over 16,000 psi, so it makes it really difficult to get there and explore. There's dangers to it, there's risks sending a vehicle down that deep, and that makes it really exciting. The Hadal Deep Sea Explorer Orpheus is basically a brand new vehicle. We wanted to start off really small, just getting the vehicle in the water, getting everything wet, knowing that all of our systems can work in the water and are running and collecting data and our cameras work.
As we were writing the initial code for Orpheus, we were headed out to the monuments toward deeper water, hopefully to test some of the capabilities of Orpheus. Everybody was a little bit nervous, on edge. Whenever you cut the safety line, it's a big new step.
There's 4 cameras in the vehicle. As we transect across the seafloor, they're taking pictures and stitching all of the pictures together. The idea is that eventually we could have a fleet of Hadal drones that can all work together. Today, we tested out one aspect of the autonomous mission, one of the most important aspects, and that's dropping the weights so that the vehicle can come to the surface again and we can recover it. This mission has been a really great step towards providing 3D images of the seafloor to the scientific world. It's all new, it's all exciting, it's all a learning experience. Getting down to those depths takes a lot of work, and there's still so much more exploring to do.
Orpheus is a vehicle we've been working on since about 2018 on here, and there's a pair of them, as you saw, both Orpheus and Eurydice, as we descend down to the Hadal depths. Now, why is NASA involved in this at all on here? It turns out as we go and explore the solar system, as we seek out life on worlds beyond our own out there, really these ocean worlds where we think we might be able to find life, we find that testing in analog environments is the best way that we can carry out these missions on. When we start with exploration are building these craft, one of the most challenging pieces is that we do not fully understand the environment, or we do not fully prepare for it along the way. On Europa, at the bottom of the ocean, well, first you have about 2 to 20 kilometers of ice on this moon of Jupiter, followed by about 100 kilometers of ocean water, as best we can tell. With this very deep ocean on there, but a much smaller world, it turns out that the pressures at the bottom of Europa's ocean are about the same as the pressures at the bottom of the Mariana Trench here on Earth. So by developing and by testing our vehicles here on Earth, we are testing in a near environment that we can reach at this point prior to getting out to Europa. Now, Orpheus and the Orpheus vehicles on here are powered by commercial off-the-shelf technology on board. There is a Raspberry Pi that is in the front of it there, running the full system on board. A lot of the sensors that are in there are coming from places like Adafruit and SparkFun within the primary sphere. And then it's married with some deep ocean type technologies, such as the thrusters that are on there, the lights, things that are rated for the pressures that are there. But the fundamental pieces that are in the core of Orpheus itself are in your smartphone. They're in your laptop. They're the same parts that are out there. Orpheus as a vehicle overall is, in terms of an analog, is very close to the Ingenuity helicopter for Mars on here, except we're going down to the bottom of the ocean. We are designed to not only survey over distances, but then to land at the bottom, to sit on these two legs and take a closer look at what is going on down there before taking off again and surveying the surrounding environment. When Orpheus departs, it is one of our smaller vehicles that we use for the deep ocean. It has to be robust enough to survive the waves or it reaches the surface. But once you descend down, not as large as many of the other vessels. It's about 2 meters in size and about 300 pounds or so when you're lifting it up. So tipping it off the side of a ship on there still takes a crane, but you can move it around with 1 or 2 people at least. As we developed Orpheus, we put a number of different features on board here. We're taking a look from the bottom side of the vehicle itself on here. And you can see that the electronics in the pressure housing, this glass sphere that is at the front, contains a 1 atmosphere environment. Actually, we dropped that a little bit in vacuum, but commercial off-the-shelf technology in the front. We have sensors that are dedicated to the mission at hand, just reaching the bottom and just traversing about 2 meters off the bottom there with our altimeter. But other than a altimeter on board, we actually don't use any sonars on this particular vehicle there. They're too expensive for us. We went along the lines of low-cost exploration. And with that, we use visual odometry. So we have a number of cameras that are looking at features on the bottom, and with those features, able to construct the path that we are traversing and how far we have actually traveled. We have our landing skids that I've mentioned, and in the center of the vehicle, a customizable payload and sampling bay that we can put different instruments depending on what we are going to carry out. A connectivity, temperature, and depth instrument, or CTD, on there, which is standard for many different ocean vessels, letting us know how deep we have gone, what the temperature of the water is, and what the connectivity is, as those 3 parameters really dictate the speed of sound in water and a lot of the various sonar measurements that we might need to take with other things. We have 4 thrusters on board, 2 that are vertical, 2 that are horizontal, allowing us to traverse across the bottom. And then we have descent and ascent weights that allow us to go down in essentially an unpowered state until we trigger those weights to drop. Then we turn into a fairly neutrally buoyant vehicle. And finally, ascent weights that we can drop to allow us to come back up to the surface on here. So there's some custom pieces on here that are designed for the fact that we are operating in an ocean. We have a buoyant environment that we can work in, like playing with our density. And so we have these droppable weights on board. We have the landing skids for how close we're getting to the bottom, and we have that altimeter that happens to work in an acoustic manner on here. But otherwise, all these things are a generic system. This would look very similar if we were making a drone and operating it in air today. Now, Orpheus has been on a number of different missions over time. We've been deploying it since 2019 on here. We designed it for 11 kilometers depth. There are components at the moment on there that are only rated down to 6 kilometers. And that's just because we are iterating what missions that we're actually carrying out. We've been off of New England a handful of times, Florida once, and we're headed up to the Aleutian Islands next year with these vehicles to start carrying out actual science operations on board. But it is meant really for this high-risk scouting and map generation. For ocean vehicles, this thing is low cost. You can build one for several hundreds of thousands of dollars on here, as opposed to millions to tens of millions of dollars for many of the more traditional vehicles that are out there. And we're going to go down for a short period of time, something like 6 to 12 hours of endurance, so about a half day, before popping back up, charging the batteries, and continuing to carry out our mission on board. We've done a number of different things on here to make the vehicle a little easier to use, including having altitude hold, which you might find on your various drones out there, and doing terrain following navigation on board. Having a mission scripting that, if you've worked spacecraft operations, is very similar. It actually runs sequences on board here, and kind of married the experience from Woods Hole to what was available from JPL. But again, you might ask on why are NASA engineers so invested in the ocean side of things? And I do point you towards Europa itself, this moon of Jupiter that's out there. Ice-covered ocean on the surface of this world, and underneath that ice, at least underneath the ice here on Earth, we find that it can be teeming with life. So we don't know what's on Europa. We do know we can explore ice environments here on Earth, and every time we find an interface, an ice-water interface on here, we have found life. Every time we found water on Earth, we tend to find that life continues to survive and thrive in these environments. So our investigations were to say, well, how can we get a closer look at this ice-water interface here? And as we do take a look with this, we find that life not only thrives in terms of microbes and these algal mats that are on the bottom, but that those serve as an ecosystem for other things that might come up and eat there. Not only do they eat there, but they actually live in the protection of the algal mat. They'll leave eggs and such within there as these fish approach, and then those support a larger and larger set of species beyond that there. Every time we find an interface like this, we tend to find life tends to anchor to it. They like the fact that because of buoyancy, we have nutrients that come up to the surface, or that they have a safe place to live on here. But the problem when explore these areas with little drones or with our various explorers, the very act of us approaching the surface tends to destroy it. If we take a more traditional submersible that has thrusters on board and approach the surface to take a sample, those thrusters do a very good job of cleaning it off. So there's nothing more that we can actually do at that spot on them. So based on these lessons, we actually designed a new type of vehicle, a roving vehicle that was buoyant and would actually drive on the underside of the ice. With this type of vehicle on board, we have a primary body on here and two wheels along with a tail. So essentially, as we turn these wheels, the tail prevents us from rotating the whole vehicle itself, and we're able to traverse across the surface on here. This particular picture was taken up at June Lake back in about 2016 or so, and shows the up above it. But it is another one of these analog environments where, because we have these ice-covered lakes here, we can learn a lot by testing here on Earth before heading out deeper into the solar system. Now, Brewery, or the Buoyant Rover for Under Ice Exploration, has been around since about 2012 on here. This photo is from 2013 up in the lakes near Barrow, Alaska. And here we were looking at methane seeps. The interesting thing about these methane seeps is that we know that there is a lot of methane coming out of these so-called thermokarst lakes up near Barrow. However, what we don't know is, why is the methane being generated? Is it being generated due to biological processes? Is it being generated due to geological processes up here? And through various measurements with our scientists, we were able to determine what the ratios were on here. But part of the problem is finding these methane seeps. And to do so, we actually go when the ice is just freezing over on these lakes. Because at that point, the turbulence caused by bubbles coming up from the bottom keeps the areas where there are seeps. open water. So instead of having to find all the bubbles throughout a large lake on there, we just need to look for where are the dark spots of open water. And we can identify that these are highly likely to be seep areas. And we designed the rover to go under the ice so that we would stop having to poke a hole in the ice, look for bubbles, not see any bubbles, move 10 feet, poke a hole in the ice, look for bubbles, not find any bubbles, and keep going, and design this type of explorer on here. What we found, though, in the motivation for looking for these bubbles was that we were able to traverse this under ice environment and get that closer look to where there might be life basically anchoring on. Now, we started this vehicle, as I mentioned, back in 2011. This was one of the early versions on here with some very narrow, essentially circular saw-bladed wheels and a tether on board that we could take and deploy under the ice. One of the first challenges we found was that without any navigation sensors, we did a lot of sweeping of snow off the ice itself in order to know where the rover was and how to drive it around. And the other challenges that we ran into, and we continue to run into anytime there is a tether, is that tether gets caught on everything. So it'll get tangled, and we have circular saw blades for our wheels on there. So not only does it get tangled, but we slice that tether every time we deploy the tether that is out there. Not only that, but with a tether on board, it's not like we're going to have a long line going from Europa back to Earth on here. So we need to cut that and remove it in some manner. And back in around 2013, we had upgraded our wheels. We put paddles on here because those circular saw blades would cut through very thin and soft ice, allowing us to basically the rover to surface up into the ice and get stuck there. So we put paddles on. And we switched over, in this case, to an RF system for communication under the ice and removing the tether. Now, RF in this case was a stand-in. We wanted to move to acoustic. This worked well enough out to about 50 feet on thin ice, and we were able to carry out this mission. But the idea was to cut that tether, to go to a more wireless system here to communicate and run the rover itself. As we continued to iterate the rover and send it down under the ice, sometimes it too looked a little bit worried about what we were about to send it out on. We learned more lessons along the way, and we continued to iterate the program here. Now, Brewery has a lot of capabilities that are on board, and some of these you might find as close analogs to what was on Orpheus earlier here. This particular version, we're using, again, Raspberry Pis and the Raspberry cameras on board. It's a lot of COTS electronics that are there. We have upgraded to an acoustic navigation and communication system. The wheels that as I mentioned, have been optimized, and we do onboard localization and data processing within here. The primary computer there is an Arduino Dewey. This is off-the-shelf, very accessible type of electronics that we are using, which allows us to change things as we learn more and iterate very, very quickly along the way. There's a lot of 3D printed parts that are on the inside, such as the light mounts that are in there, along with quick prototyping type manufacturing for the other pieces of the vehicle. The most important thing that we've been able to do, though, is because it's so low cost, because we can test in these environments like June Lake, like Bear, Alaska, is we can iterate and go from field test to field test, making appropriate upgrades along the way and learning from there, designing a better vehicle, designing and optimizing a vehicle over time. So this thing
Yes, hello?
Yes, yeah, sure.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I was told that it was okay to go ahead and ask questions during your presentation.
Sure.
I have a question. On a real, I realize these are prototype units, but I was curious as to, I see you're using batteries and such on these units, but for an actual spacecraft that would be sent to explore the icy moons like Europa or Enceladus, would they be using something like a RTG, like some of these other probes, in order to have the availability of underwater power for extended exploratory dives and just mission endurance?
Well, it really comes back to that last thing you said, and that is mission on there. So depending on what the mission objectives were, you would be trying to optimize the vehicle for that. We can foresee that some missions that you might be carrying out might be very short duration on there, where there's not enough time to or a need to recharge the vehicle. And there you might use a lithium primary or some other primary type of battery cell for kind of a one shot. It's lower cost, but also a lot lower of complexity than using something like an RTG. But the benefits of an RTG are that it is going to allow you to extend your mission, of course, have power over longer periods on there, and carry out more objectives at the cost of increased complexity along the way. So I think the challenge for us as we design these missions and identify the objectives are, should I carry one or even just a couple of complex explorers underneath the ice, or perhaps many explorers that have primary cells on board that are very simple and can kind of throw them away as objectives are met. All of this ties back to how much mass you can actually bring out to the world that you're trying to explore on there. So I don't think we have a good answer yet, and it might be a hybrid where, say, a descent craft or a drill might have some kind of RTG on board, and then a rover like this could have batteries and return to that for charging, or some other solution on there. But no good answer for you completely yet.
So could there perhaps be a tethered type of power from a surface type base that would allow it to have say the actual probe itself be a simpler device, and then have power conducted down to it from a stationary surface type of power unit, and thus I realize that would perhaps limit maybe depth or distance that you would explore, but I guess that could be one possible solution.
That's correct. There are all sorts of speculative concepts that are out there that are being examined. Tethers from the surface certainly have been, though the trials and tribulations of going through 2 to 20 kilometers of ice, especially if that ice has any tectonic movement on there, means that tethers might be dangerous if they are frozen in. Some of the concepts that are also out there are to use acoustic pucks to transmit data all the way down through the ice, and then perhaps an RTG down at the bottom, or something on the surface if you needed the higher power that a tether could bring, but now you have the complexity of the tether there. And as I've shown earlier on this, our own vehicle often gets tangled up in that tether.
I see. Well, thank you very much for answering the questions.
Absolutely. So Brewery as a vehicle, as I mentioned, is fairly small on here. Yes, go ahead.
Testing. Is this working? Okay, so I actually have a question regarding your use of wheels on Brewery. You mentioned earlier that an underwater kind of thrusting vehicle tends to destroy the samples that you want to collect. How do you avoid that with an underwater wheeled vehicle? Because it seems to me the wheels would destroy your samples too.
Absolutely. And in some ways it does, but your contact area on the ice now comes down to just those points that are on there. So traditionally, when we look back and look at how the rover has been moving, we see no evidence of the rover in place because it's such a small contact area there, versus the submersible with the thrusters tends to destroy an area that's actually larger than the submersible itself along the way. So we cannot claim that we're not damaging the environment at all, but we're minimizing the impact, especially when we rotate our cameras up and look directly above it. We haven't touched that particular area.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure. So one of the, did you have a second question?
No, I'm just.
One of the important pieces of the rover on here is that it is so portable. We designed it to be TSA compatible. We wanted to be able to put it on an aircraft in the payload bay and take it out there. And for now, certainly, we're not going to be transporting an RTG in the payload of a commercial aircraft. So we actually use Energizer C-cell batteries that you can get in small packs in here to run the rover, because it's not lithium. It's not something we have to worry about and transport out there, but is still an available resource for us no matter where in the world that we are actually going. And we have taken this rover all over the place, including down to Casey Station into Antarctica, which is very much not Europa, but we did put an arrow to say where it might be somewhere out there. Now, we had many different visitors along the way when we were down in Casey Station. They were very curious about this big orange beast that was in their environment, but the Adelie penguins were so fantastic to be waddling down the road with us. And this was the version of the rover that we took out there, now outfitted with a number of different scientific instruments on board and beginning actually science operations down under the ice. When we first got down to Casey Station, which is one of the Australian stations down in Antarctica, just on the coast, we went out to the wharf area that had a little of an ice shelf. And you can see here as the rover moves, you can really, there's not much evidence that the wheels are impacting over there. This is a stand-in tail at the moment on there. You'll see one a little bit later with a little bit more instrumentation on board. But we were able to navigate and traverse under the ice there, doing a vehicle checkout. In a couple of these slides, you'll see that there is a tether still attached. While we do use acoustic navigation for debugging purposes when we're here on Earth, we attach a tether that actually is weighted downward so we can get high-speed data back and forth. One of the challenges with acoustics is that you have a very latent link. It's about 8 seconds for some of the packets that come across there, and it's low bandwidth for the one that we're using. So all the issues of ocean type exploration. And then we took the vehicle out to O'Brien's Bay, about a mile away, a little bit more protected from the ocean environment here, and deployed out in an area that a tidal crack and some other instrumentation, and started to navigate underneath the ice itself on kind of a lawnmower path here before traversing up to the tidal crack area. Well, as the vehicle moved, one of the things we were interested in was the very question that was asked earlier in terms of what's the impact of the tail for taking these measurements and the instruments there versus something that we push through the ice. When we drill down and push this through the ice, again, we remove that whole algal environment that we were interested in looking at. But with the tail, we're able to very precisely locate it against an area that we want to make sensor measurements. And with that tail, we had additional advantages in that we could not only look up close, but we could rotate it around. And when we did, we found all these bubbles that were starting to exist up near the ice. And in sampling them, those were actually oxygen bubbles. They were all the algal mats. They were creating their own oxygen and changing the environment for the microbes that were living around that. So we have a vehicle that someday we would love to get out to Europe, or at least a descendant of this vehicle, if you will, so that we can traverse under the ice. But when in that kind of environment, it's not just going to be flat. One of our early assumptions on Brewery, an incredibly incorrect assumption, was that icy lakes would probably be fairly flat underneath. What we have found is that the bubbles that come up tend to form cavities such that they're almost like inverted craters on the moon that we have to traverse across and around. And not only that, you can get rafted ice where ice will crack and break and shift over itself such that you can end up with crevasses that you need to cross. And in Antarctica, we found the same thing here, when this was in a deliberate test. We drove Brewery directly at the crevasse on here to determine how would we best recover a craft if we got stuck here. Now we have the tail on here. It's essentially an appendage we can use to push our way around. And with that, not only did we get ourselves into the crack, but we were able to traverse back out as well. And we then afterwards did what most people would do, is rather than go directly into the ditch, take it at an angle on here, and you can cross over fairly well. But it's this analog testing that we can do here on Earth that teaches us how we might navigate, how we might traverse these various areas out here before we go into the solar system. And we found that as we were traversing around just on the inside of things, that by being under the ice, we could actually measure the curvature of the ice and how it had actually moved as a function of depth on here. Found that in these thinner areas, there were more algal mats, and also that the conductivity had essentially decreased in here. So we were getting more fresh water in these regions rather than just the salt water there. So Brewery's been a great asset for us. And the most important thing about Brewery is that this version looks nothing like, well, maybe a little like the version from 2011 on here. It took testing, repeated testing and iteration over time for us to get to a vehicle that is now scientifically ready to explore. And this version as well is not going to be, certainly not identical to what we might send out to Europa in the future, whether it be based on power source, as the question was asked earlier, or the electronics that are on board. But by being low cost, by using COTS type things and being able to be tested in an analog environment on Earth, we can learn, we can iterate, we can improve on our design here and optimize for what we might be trying to do in the future. And again, why is NASA playing around in ice and environments on Earth? Because there are a limited number of ocean worlds as we explore the solar system. And I want to tie you back to another mission just briefly, which is called MARCO. And this is an interplanetary one. First interplanetary CubeSats that went out to Mars in 2018 on here. They, when folded up, are what are called 6-unit CubeSats, about 13 kilograms or so. And each one of these will fit as carry-on luggage underneath the seat in front of you on an aircraft. So they're pretty small. But they do represent interplanetary missions in general on here, and we can speak to the various subsystems that are on board. And it's important that we do so before returning to the point of this talk on the ocean side of things. So if I remove the front cover of one of the 2 MARCO spacecraft on here and allow you to see onto the inside, we can talk about what is carried on board. There is power generation, and in this case, it is by solar rays, but underneath this panel here are 12 18650 lithium-ion batteries, Panasonics, in this particular case on here. They are stacked in there for power storage and running the craft itself. We have a propulsion system based on thrusters, cold gas thrusters in this case here, to provide small jets to orient or maneuver the craft on here. We have a radio, an RF radio at X-band developed by JPL on here that allows us to communicate back to Earth, but it's also a transponder, so it allows us to communicate based on ranging and Doppler information. We have amplifiers for that radio on board, and we have kind of the brains of the spacecraft in a command and data handling and power system unit on board. Now, MARCO's a little unique in that it uses a TI MSP430 processor. Texas Instruments on there, the MSP430, well, this thing's often found in razor blades, shower heads, and toasters. We did actually send the brave little toaster to Mars, had a great day, took some pictures, unfortunately kept going. But our processor is tiny, 128 kilobytes of program space, 8 kilobytes of RAM on there, completed an interplanetary mission. We have an attitude control system on board, relying on reaction wheels and a number of sensors and IMU to tell us how we are oriented here, and basically are transmitting dish along the way. So we have a brain, we have power storage, we have some kind of mobility on board, and a lot of it is built on commercial parts. I'm sure you've picked this up already in there, and that there is a great analog to all the systems that we have already been talking about here in terms of the ocean environment. For what this spacecraft is and what we are already using here on Earth. So if we start to compare for a very generic spacecraft, and MARCO is one I know well, so I use that, along against, say, Orpheus, we find that there are a lot of parallels here. We have a hazardous environment. Yes, there is a pressure difference on there, but it is still hazardous in the outside world on here, where we have high vacuum for MARCO and we have high pressure for Orpheus. Get into the inner skin though, and that environment is hopefully protected against. For MARCO, we had to deal with radiation out in the space environment, and in the ocean, actually corrosion is a major factor that you have to worry about here. So don't touch that environment if you can all get away with it. MARCO was rechargeable, but they actually, between MARCO and Orpheus, they both use lithium-ion cells at this point on here. And for figuring out where we are, while one uses radio frequency and one uses acoustic, both rely on ranging and Doppler information to determine where we are underneath the, or in their respective environments. Again, while one is RF and one is acoustic, both have a significant latency tied in, one due to light time delay, the other due to speed of sound. And then they're fairly low speed, at least compared to what we have with Wi-Fi these days out here for communications. Both rely on some kind of thrusters for propulsion. We use props on propellers on Orpheus and cold gas on MARCO on here, but they do serve to orient the vehicle and provide maneuverability. Have commercial off-the-shelf type brains on board, and a software that is actually both sequence driven. Lessons from Brewery became the MARCO software lessons from Marco have now impacted Orpheus, and there's a great feedback between those various systems and the teams that we have.
Excuse me, on the Orpheus Raspberry Pi, was that a Raspberry Pi 4?
Orpheus right now is using a Raspberry Pi 3, but it
Oh,
really
3.
yeah, but it depends on what is out at the various time that we are into the brains of Orpheus for any one of those. So it does get upgraded at times. And I apologize for those online if I wasn't speaking into the speaker or into the microphone as well. In terms of mission characteristics, our two vehicles are actually very similar or have some differences in here. For Marco, it's a one-way trip. You launch, you get it out. You're going to communicate with it for the duration of the mission there, but if anything goes wrong, no one is going to service this vehicle. Orpheus has about 6 to 12-hour trips. It's daily round trip on there, and it can basically iterate along the way. With Marco, it's had a team of about 10 operators plus the entirety of the deep space network to communicate with this. And with Orpheus, we're still in kind of order of magnitude about the same, 2 to 4 people to run it, and the ship's crew to put it into the water and take it back out again. However, the cost of Marco, because really we wanted to make sure it would work, is around $18.5 million, where Orpheus at the end of the day is disposable, $500K or so. We can lose a vehicle there and continue our mission along the way. And Marco, of course, is a very small sat. Many of our larger vehicles headed out to deep space are in the hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions. Kalina? No, it's entire mission cost on there for both. It is not per mission. So I think Orpheus has about 200K of hardware cost on there. And then it depends on what ship we're going out and what we're doing for a daily cost. But a lot of this was the labor to put it together on there. So it's not quite apple to apple on the cost side, but also hard to break that down. So if we look at a lot of failures, and I would claim that this is true for ocean vehicles as well, failures can often be traced to inappropriate or inadequate testing, not getting enough time with our vehicle on there before we're going to launch it or deploy along the way. And the other part of it is maybe a misunderstanding of systems or processes with respect to that vehicle.
If I'm not mistaken, weren't there 2 Marcos that were sent on that mission, and one of them perhaps had some problems?
Oh, both Marcos had many problems along the way. And there were 2 Marcos that were up, both Wally and Eva. There were the primary problem that you've likely heard about was with Wally and a cold gas system that developed a leak 11 days after launch. And we had to change how we were actually going to fly that craft out there, moving from one that was, we'll call it relatively high propulsion, 5 maneuvers or so on the way out to Mars, to something where we had to perform a maneuver every 15 minutes over 6.5 months to stabilize it along the way. That's a whole other story.
That was a fantastic use of small sats, CubeSats. That's marvelous.
It was a great mission, and one that really was supported by the entire community out there, the CubeSat community and such, as we got this to go forward. And now we're seeing the benefits from trying a mission like that. I'll repeat the question. Yeah.
My question is for Marco. 18.5 million was in 2018 or 2015. What
$2018? Yes.
Yeah. How about now?
Luckily, I am not. So the question was, Marco was 18.5 million back in 2018, and frankly, Orpheus numbers are back in about 2018 or 2019. Luckily, as Kalina well knows, I am not on the financial side of things, so I cannot do the translation up to today dollars on here. I can say that there are a number of other missions that have now gone towards interplanetary space that are built from universities along the way, small companies, as well as NASA centers there. And like CubeSats around the Earth, there is a variety, a wide range of costs that have been associated with those there, from the millions of dollars up to the tens of millions of dollars.
There's actually I believe it was the flashlight mission that just unfortunately was non-functional. It's too bad that there wasn't a redundancy built into that. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that mission or not, to illuminate some of the South Pole craters on the moon for detection of frozen ices and such. But I believe this mission has now been terminated due to some failure of the, and I believe that was also a CubeSat, correct?
That's correct. So Lunar Flashlight was another JPL mission operated by Georgia Tech that launched back in late November of 2022 on there. It did have issues with its propulsion system, where NASA and JPL have now said that the mission is over with respect to the objective of mapping water ice in the moon, but it does continue to this day, operated by Georgia Tech, and quite successfully over there in terms of a checkout of many technologies and such. And from working with the students at Georgia Tech, they have done an incredible job of continuing that mission along in spite of some of the problems that it has had.
Yes, I have a question. My name's Dan.
Sure.
Will Orpheus be tested in the Marianas Trench, and if so, when?
We certainly hope so. We are looking to see when we might get out to the Marianas Trench. We have been slowly increasing both our depth and operational complexity over time on here and towards those opportunities. But like spaceflight, opportunities to get out to the various trenches are few and far in between. So we are still working to see when we might get out there.
Yeah, well, that's great. And I think as a systems engineer myself, it excites me to see your iterative approach to this development, because the requirements are being developed along the way based on your experiences, and that's got to be exciting.
Absolutely. Now, as a system engineer and one that works on a lot of the missions, both in spaceflight and elsewhere on here, I'm not someone who actually likes the requirements process or the working through that along the way, but through this, as we go, especially as we turn things around very quickly on here, we derive or we very much in some ways incorporate those requirements as we find them there. And we find that the vehicle, as we go forward, does bear that burden, that weight of experience, if you will, of lessons from the deep on there that essentially become our more formal requirements on the next iteration. It does take some time sometimes where you have to start with a different vehicle to break yourself out of that. Say, I've learned a lot in the past, but are any of these requirements or these lessons overburdensome? And we need to change our way of thinking about it, which is why in some things like the ocean, trying different vehicles, seeing different perspectives on there can better optimize what you're doing forward.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Yeah, just thank you. That answered my question.
Absolutely. And I'll kind of step from that to say that whether it's ChatGPT or any number of other autonomous things that or AI that we're finding in our daily lives, likewise on these vehicles, we are starting to take advantage more and more of software in terms of what we can do with these missions. Autonomy is increasing and able to perform more aspects of our mission than ever before in here. And with that, there is significant increase in complexity. One of the things that I still always have an issue with is flying a Linux computer on any one of our vehicles here, as opposed to a simple microcontroller. Because often with a Linux system, there is a lot of baggage that comes along with it that any individual member on the team or even the team as a whole may not fully understand. For a long time, whenever you would launch Linux, every once in a while, it would boot up and suddenly start into a memory check, which would take 5 to 30 minutes to complete before your vehicle could actually boot on there. You never quite knew when that was going to happen along the way. And if you had someone who was very familiar with the system, maybe they could disable it. But it was complexity that could cause a challenge. So as our software increases in complexity, as we rely more on autonomy, should we not iterate more in a real world setting before we send something out on a one-way trip? And this is really where the crux of my argument comes in that we should be making use of the ocean environment where we can iterate with systems that are very close to what we are flying in space, for a number of different tests that might be out there. So
Uh,
what, go ahead.
Excuse me, with the especially with the Orpheus diver, have you had any encounters with say marine mammals? I'm just curious if there were to be some life forms on Europa that perhaps would have some curiosity as to what this novel thing was that they were seeing. Have you encountered any sort of interactions with any marine organisms during your dives that you might need to anticipate in order to interact with or avoid, etc.?
Well, while we hope to find some kind of life elsewhere in the solar system yet, we certainly have not at this point to Europa on here. In the ocean with Orpheus, there have been a few, at least telemetry points where we have seen a sun attitude change that might be ascribed to some kind of larger life. Off of Florida, actually, was where we saw something. We certainly, with our various vehicles, have seen larger life down there. I'll show you a couple of pictures in a second here. With Brewery, it's been the Adelie penguins underneath. With Orpheus, we weren't quite clear on what it might have been down there. And then with some of our other vehicles, we've seen octopus and other things down at depth. We're not quite sure what all the things will be that we need to anticipate there, but it's with those that I think we do well on at least the attitude side of designing for unexpected disturbance, if you will, and making our feedback loops and such robust to that. And at the end of the day, hopefully our response is stop. Don't keep moving around on there if you have a significant disturbance, and allow ourselves to observe what's happening and then find an appropriate course of action. Whether we do that based on ground autonomy, I think really is something that will have to be developed.
Hello, Andy.
Yes.
Hi, this is Lisa Gothard. I'm the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory Solar System Ambassador, and also a citizen scientist. And I really do appreciate your presentation, especially with the kickoff of the video about Orpheus. I have been sharing the mission about the deep ocean and the deep space and their correlation with humanities, how it really does apply with us from the deep ocean, because it does offer neutral buoyancy, much like we have our astronauts in, having a spacewalk such as yesterday. There are multiple things that we are doing with our oceans, such as mapping the entire seabed floor and our lakes. And this is very important. So I really do like all the understanding and opportunities of going to the Hadal Zone and Antarctica. I did share the Orpheus video for our students who do first tech robotics that we support. And the 3D components that you shared in your presentation that you do use for, such as Brewery, I really love how Brewery goes rolling underneath the ice ocean. And I shared this component as well. But the 3D components that you use, is there any specific additive manufacturing that you implement for the temperature level under the ice?
So with respect to the 3D printing there, and I do appreciate that you're able to share this with a wider community as well. Brewery is unique. In the Arctic, in cold under ice regions up there, it is actually warmer when you are in the water than when you are on the surface. In the water, it's above 32 Fahrenheit. It's water, right? It's not frozen ice on there, which for electronics is actually a very healthy temperature. On board Brewery, inside the housing itself, it's actually sitting around room temperature on there because of the processors, because of the use of power on board. So it's not actually that bad of an environment within there. Now, we also use 3D printed parts down in the ocean when we're diving down to depths on there, even with significant pressures. And really the normal fused deposit manufacturing that we have in a lot of these desktop printers. I saw some of those things go down to 5,000 meters last summer on some of these vehicles here and still survive the pressure environments that is there. There are a lot of different filaments that are out there that your students can make use of that have various temperature ratings and such. And I would argue that it is only test or looking up those characteristics that you can find things out. But the quickest way is print it, test it, throw it in, see what happens, and then iterate from there.
Okay, excellent. One more question regarding the manufacturing of these things. I am sharing the new term that has been coined by our JPL members and another speaker with the NASA Ocean Worlds program, such as Europa and Enceladus and Titan. And going forward in sharing planetary oceanography, which is a new field that everyone is very excited about, which I am very excited to share with audiences young and old, K through gray, as I say. Do you have any suggestions with respect to how the individuals may be involved? I know you have OceanX, and OceanX is a nonprofit organization, and you have WHOI, which is Woods Hole out of Maine. So I'm familiar with WHOI and I'm involved with there. But what about the research vessel, the Neil Armstrong? It was recently docked in Charleston, South Carolina. We had the SpaceX, one of their vessels that was docked in our Charleston harbor as well for dry docking. What about the research vessels that are going out? Are you having more interest?
So we continue to work with both Woods Hole and Scripps and other oceanographic institutions for all of these. The research vessel Neil Armstrong is actually a Woods Hole vessel along with its sister ship, the Sally Ride, out of Scripps on here, part of what's called the UNOLS organization. We do partner with many of them along with NOAA and others here for the deployment of these various vehicles. And we're working together through a lot of these Ocean Worlds programs sponsored by NASA, by NSF, and others on there to look for opportunities that we can test on there and also partner to bring our educational colleagues along the way as well.
Thank you so much. I truly appreciate the information. And I am familiar with Scripps and the members that you just shared. So that's very helpful to know. Thank you.
Sure, great. So when we tie in the ocean to space exploration on here, there's really 4 areas that I would argue are ideal. There's the easy one. We want to explore ocean worlds. There's a great ocean world analog right here on Earth in that we are an ocean world. We can take Brewery out, we can take Orpheus out, and it serves as a great analog. The next one is really the opportunity for iteration on here. And this is really where I'd like to expand to a more broader spacecraft sense, where if we are starting to send a craft out with new autonomy out into deep space or with communication capabilities on board that we have not otherwise tested, the ocean provides a great environment that we can iterate with real world effects on board for us to try and improve the vehicle before we launch, improve the autonomy there. Because oftentimes in simulation we find that we treat it a little bit differently on here. There's some aspects that are ignored along the way, or people just say it's a computer simulation. We don't get as much out of it. The third is really on this ops and autonomy test bed here. And this is something that we're trying to do with the Buoyant rover because of its latent communication links, because of its the low bandwidth that we have on board. We're actually using it to train scientists on how they might interact with a vehicle on another planet, but one where they have real science objectives they're trying to meet on Earth as well. In some ways, they're properly motivated to get this right because they care about the outcome on here. What we're hoping to do is actually take Brewery up to the Alaska environment where we're looking for these methane seeps, allow it to operate over a couple of months on there with science operators remotely back down at JPL, and have them drive the vehicle, plan it out, and have to balance their objectives for science against the energy constraints of primary batteries on board. A very real environment before they go and do the same thing on other worlds, even like on Mars with Ingenuity and with Mars 2020. And then finally, the one that I haven't spoken about yet, which is multi-vehicle systems. As we start to develop more of our vehicles and get out to explore, we're finding that single vehicles are, well, they can only look at a very specific area. The multiplication of opportunity that we are getting through the use of Ingenuity on Mars right now with M2020 has really been eye-opening. Ingenuity was supposed to be a tech demo, done within 30 days, 5 flights, and it was to be put to the side so the primary science could be done with Perseverance. Now we are seeing that Ingenuity's mapping over there is informing the science opportunities for 2020. We are looking forward to how various architectures in the future might make use of other potential science helicopters and such, and how we can expand our presence using these methods on other worlds as well. But it's not only on the robotic side of things that stuff gets interesting. I was lucky enough to have an opportunity last summer to board the research vessel Atlantis out there and dive with Alvin. And Alvin is a vehicle that has been around since the 1960s. Every aspect of it has been changed for that point, for which I'm very thankful. But it is still a very operating vehicle that goes down into the depths of the ocean. It's now rated for 6,500 meters down. So significant part of our ocean, about halfway and just entering into the Hadal zone there. And up front, you have a 7.5-foot titanium sphere that can hold up to 3 crew members on board. Just outside the windows that are there, you have some robotic arms and a payload basket that a number of different payloads can be mounted onto. And the rest of this is really for both survival as well as traversing underneath the ice. On our particular journey, as we went down, this is just under the surface. You can see one of the robotic arms here and an instrument we would later grab and sample some of the chemical plumes. But as we approach the bottom, about 2,500 meters down, just outside one of the port windows, we had an octopus just kind of float by. Now, the unique thing about the ocean is if you go out there and dive in any individual spot, most likely you're going to find sand. And it's going to be plains and plains of sand at any significant depth, more than about 1,000 meters or so. There are hotspots. There are areas of significant activity and interest down there where when you start to sample something, you might get a tube worm that is just sitting off to the outside, or even more exciting areas where we have hydrothermal vents, or the so-called black smokers out there. And then these just beautiful covered rocks in the areas of these vents that have all of these different organisms that are on there kind of flowing with the currents in the water there. So we have a broad area where there's pretty much nothing. And we have a lot of more specific areas of high scientific interest. Alvin is a very expensive vehicle to run. There's a large ship behind it. There's a lot of human safety that has to be taken into account there. So you want to make every minute count on the way. Now, you can't take that many people down. Like I said, 7.5-foot sphere. However, you have half of it taken up by life support equipment in there. You've got displays up above, and you essentially have 2 benches that are underneath the side windows, 1 motorcycle seat in the center, and there's 3 of you that are jammed in there for the duration of the trip. So there's not a lot of room for any of this. Well, what we really are looking at doing is trying to expand our reach for this, because exploration is really an expansion of human knowledge in some manner, no matter what world you are trying to explore. And if we can use these robotic tools to expand our reach, then something like Alvin, then something like Artemis can still travel to where crew members can go to the most interesting spots, but use the robotic assets out there in a more multi-vehicle fashion to scout out and identify where those are before you send the humans out to those spots. So if we partner with multiple specialized assets, Orpheus for surveying the area over there, Ingenuity for trying to identify where there's specific scientific or areas of scientific interest, or even Brewery for traversing under the ice where scuba divers will do the same thing and wash everything off the top there, we can multiply our reach along the way. But before we can get to that point, we really have to practice. We have to iterate. We have to improve our vehicles and our understanding of the software and autonomy that is there in order to be more effective in the environment here. So at the end of the day, field testing and whether an operations really catalyzes solutions that are out there. It forces you to come up with, well, deal with the failures that might be there, and it inspires the creativity in operations. By starting with Brewery and miniaturizing, looking to try and build something that could traverse under the ice from my travels at least, that has led now to augmenting crude development of under ice explorers on there over the course of about a decade on here, and has actually improved the spaceflight operations and spaceflight systems that I'm involved in as we work at JPL. The analogs provide the realism. You want to find a good analog for the environment on there, and in space travel, those are few and far between. The ocean actually provides quite a few different parallels there that we might make use of. And as I've said in different talks here, you really want to iterate, and you want to fail a lot along the way. If those failures are going to provide the opportunities and the motivation for you to then succeed, but you need the environment for which to do so. The real world risk acceptance there then provides options. We have our scientists that are no longer just dealing with a computer simulation, but are actually having to carry out a scientific mission. And then doing things in a low cost manner with research and development programs where you can iterate really provides that experience for handling the in-flight failures that inevitably are going to happen along the way. So we have the oceans around the world. We have a very healthy research program around the world as well, with a number of different vessels. They are a valuable and accessible test bed. So let's use them here. Let's see how we can better partner between NASA, between other space-faring entities, and the ocean exploration community, so we can improve our craft in both areas on there, but especially autonomy, communication, and ultimately exploration. So that's my thesis for today on here. I hope you also enjoyed the photos along the way. I'm open to any questions you might have, whether online or in person here. And thank you again for attending the AIAA talk. Yeah, back there first. Yeah, since we have partners online, we'll go through the microphone.
No, smart. What's the ETA? Do you have any deadlines for when you might actually get to Europa, or some target you're shooting for in preparation of that?
The Europa program is actually quite exciting right now because we have Europa Clipper that's going to be launching soon, allow us to get that first kind of mapped glance of the outside of the world over there. After Europa Clipper, we have hopes in the future and concepts out there for something like Europa Lander to touch the surface, get down, then we have to figure out how to get down through the ice. Then maybe Brewery or a descendant thereof might be able to get there. It's going to be a while, but that is some of the fun of space exploration on here, is that you can work a full career on working through all these steps in a totally unknown world. We have a lot of interesting tech that's out there, whether it's EELS or the Prime mission to R&D efforts to try and dig down through the ice. And slowly we are getting to something that might work. But as for an ETA, I think we're still several decades out, if only because it takes us 7 years to get out to Jupiter. So it's not very quick to reach that. So there, the question was whether it was an opportune window to fly out to Jupiter on here. And it really depends. We have incredible magicians at JPL when it comes to trajectories. And sometimes it's not necessarily alignment. It's how can we bounce between the various planets, tie that to the various technologies that we're looking at for propulsion on here that will maximize or optimize how we can get out there. Yeah.
I just had two questions. One was with all the open source technology, or I'm sorry, with COTS, we have 3-axis accelerometers that are fairly easy to leverage. Mm-hmm. And I noticed that in both Orpheus and Brewery that we're not leveraging 3-axis accelerometers to create like a Kalman filtered solution to position or navigation. So I was curious why that design decision was made.
Both actually do use extended Kalman filters on board with an IMU on there.
Oh, okay.
Didn't point out a number of sensors that were also on there, but there is a Kalman filter on board. They use an IMU, a COTS IMU that is there. Orpheus actually uses a RG Pilot derivative in there for flying it around on board. And Brewery right now has three different IMUs, because each pod can actually rotate independently on there. There's a challenge though with Brewery, because there's motors inside there, and while the accelerometers are fine, the magnetometers are disturbed by the permanent magnets in the motor. So every time we rotate, we have to recalibrate the entire vehicle in essence. So that's a whole lot of other fun.
So one more question was, with JPL's challenge using Linux versus microcontrollers, has there been any consideration for JPL developing like a JPL OS that would actually take the kernel and strip out all those things that you find problematic, and then, support an open source development effort to say, we have this nice, space exploration or under ice or oceanographic OS devoted entirely for autonomy and probe control, if you will.
And I want to be careful there to say that it is my problems with Linux that I have seen over time, as opposed to JPL as a whole on here, just in terms of the complexity that is with the operating system on there. There's a number of different systems that JPL uses. The one that is very much being developed and used throughout the industry right now is something called F prime that has been very focused for the use of both operations on board, as well as the inclusion of various autonomous aspects there. But each mission has different requirements. Marco actually flew 2 Linux computers on board as well, these little gumsticks computers running a fairly generic version of Linux there. So we use all sorts of things depending on what our mission requirements are. And I think that's the most important piece of identifying what you are trying to do and do a design against that, as opposed to trying to shoehorn something in there.
I'm thinking a modular approach where you have an executable file actually cover standard aspect of operation, and then use API or something like that.
Right.
Make it fit what you need.
And it depends on the mission. There are various aspects. Some missions do have things like that for fault protection and such along the way. Yeah. Grab the mic here.
So it's kind of a follow-on to what you said. I liked your charts of the Marco versus Orpheus. Do you have something similar that's Orpheus versus future Europa or whatever Explorer? And now that you've gotten through a few, looks like mission architecture iterations, are you now going the next level down and looking at COTS, but maybe space rated or something like that, for particularly as you go to deeper pressures, for testing out? Is there a systematic way that you're doing that to actually enable and support what people are looking at architecturally for these future missions?
I'll say yes and no with some of that on there. We are certainly doing so more in the instrumentation and call it the external parts of the vehicle, the ones that actually interact with the environment on there, or what we can miniaturize. The scientific community in particular has done a great job of looking at what instruments would be most applicable, and we're trying to fold those in to our architecture and design and start working with those. A good example was the cameras versus a sonar system on board. While on a larger space mission, we might have the budget to afford a sonar, the power requirements, the size and such that a sonar would require on there are likely not able to be carried for a Europa mission. And so by using the cameras and such, and our camera analogs here, developing that technology, it's much more suitable from Europa, even though going to sonar would be far easier for the ocean exploration that we're trying to do. So there are some aspects of that, but we haven't done it on a holistic level at this point.
Yeah, I have 2 questions about the Orpheus technology. The first one is a multi-vehicle system architecture. When you say the multi-vehicle underwater systems, do they establish a communication between each other, or does the system include the centralized operation include mothership operation center or something?
Currently, for the 2 vehicles that we have, we are involving the mothership. where each one goes down, develops its own map, and only on its return to the surface do we share the maps and then merge them together. We are looking at an architecture in the near future where we will have inter-vehicle communications down there. And we're currently debating on whether we're going to do full map transport or actually do a multi-vehicle SLAM where only the relevant nodes and knowledge is essentially exchanged on there. There are benefits to all of those. I like the multi-vehicle communication because then you can start throwing in additional ones like Alvin or these other assets that you might have. There's something called Sentry and others that we're talking about as well in there. So I hope we have to investigate how much information do we have to share, as that will change the communication requirements that we have to build in.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, we are working with some multi-vehicle systems for the space mission and the lunar surface mission. So I'm very curious about the architecture.
Well, and especially if you're working on the lunar side, check out the Cadre mission at JPL that's being developed. That is a 3 rover system. I think it's launching in 2024, 2025, but they just went into testing the other day. So cool. They're doing quite well.
Different areas. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And the second question is, I'm very curious about the vision system on the Orpheus. So the deep sea camera is a kind of code product with retrofit or free scratch developed. Yeah. What kind of countermeasures do they have? Or
for much of what we do on Orpheus and our other vehicles, we often will take a pressure housing that is rated for depth, but just have COTS equipment on the inside. Currently, Orpheus uses an MV Blue Fox USB 3 camera that is in there and works well. Brewery uses a low light HD camera from Blue Robotics and a Raspberry Pi. We have both of them on, and an Open MV camera. On my living room table right now, there is the next generation of the Orpheus cameras that are actually going to be using a Voxel Snapdragon in there with a small camera module attached to that will have more ability to do onboard visual odometry on there without relying on the rest of the processing system there. So that's what we're moving to very, very shortly.
Wow, that's very interesting. Yeah, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Hi. So I was actually kind of just looking up the camera. So I was actually kind of curious about the choice of batteries on Orpheus and on, future Europa missions that you mentioned, because in both cases you mentioned that these systems would likely use primaries, the alkalines for the Orpheus and lithium primary on a Europa mission. Now I'm just kind of curious, why a primary instead of, say, like a nickel metal hydride rechargeable, and how are you going to deal with temperature if you're using a battery?
A couple things with it. First, the main thing to remember is that no architecture is yet chosen because no objectives have yet been identified for that on there. Once you have mission objectives, you can go down and look at how can I meet these objectives and then choose a battery system or power system to really meet that there. Orpheus is using lithium batteries to allow us to recharge it out on the ship right now. We use something called inspired packs that have lithium ion cells inside there that have to meet a number of different safety requirements and other things that are there. For Europa, when we head out there, it will really depend on what we are trying to do and if we can afford mass-wise to have a large system with the complexity of recharging on board, or if we need to keep things incredibly simple and potentially smaller by using primary cells. As we found with Brewery, though, we don't have to worry about, or at least we haven't had to worry about the internal environment as much, because if you are in liquid water, by definition, you're almost in a temperature that the batteries are pretty healthy at. And so it's something that we all know, but it's not intuitive that it's actually pretty warm down under the ice there.
Fair enough. And I think I must have gotten confused with the batteries on Orpheus and Brewery. Brewery is the one that's using alkaline primaries, right?
Correct. And that is primarily because we want to transport it on a plane and have had issues.
So yeah, okay. I think I had the other question was, it'll come back to me.
Sure. Any questions online out there?
Yeah, I have a question. With the increasing sort of focus on ocean pollution, say with plastics, are there any applications that you foresee for some of these devices for either mapping pollution or perhaps even in cleanup applications for the oceans?
So with the Orpheus vehicles here, we are looking at, well, they're designed for mapping certain environments and carrying payloads on board. We have partnered with NOAA in the past to carry payloads that they might have to survey environments with their eDNA program to map what biological life is out there. But I could absolutely see us carrying a payload to map what potential pollution or contaminants might be in the water as well. In terms of cleanup, again, we'd have to go back to what would be the mission objectives there, and is Orpheus the right vehicle for that? Because some of the vehicles that we have out there might have more endurance or more ability to go near the bottom than perhaps what Orpheus has. And we often find ourselves saying, hey, we have this vehicle that should go and do this other task, but if it's not really optimized for it, it may not be able to accomplish as well for something like that. So we'd have to examine it a little closer.
And before you sign off, I would certainly like to wish you the best of luck on your NASA application for the astronaut program. I sincerely think you would make an excellent candidate, and wish you the best of luck on that.
Thank you. Okay.
Hello, Andy.
Yes.
It's Lisa Gothard again once more. Just to button up, and I apologize, I misspoke when I stated Maine rather than Massachusetts for Hui, which I should clarify that. Love your presentation. Wanted to question you about, you mentioned partnerships, looking for other commercial entities that may be interested in continuing with competition or building or collaboration of efforts to get these products not only to the Hadal Zone or the Mariana Trench, but also to Europa and Enceladus. And, you know, perhaps, you know, other interplanetary objects in our solar system. There is Boeing that has their missions with the U.S. Naval Research support. Now, Boeing has a lot of unmanned rovers that do have submersible entities and projects under the ocean on Earth, and have been doing so since the 60s. Would there be latitude to partner with Boeing on some of these projects, or the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory, being that they have the expertise that could perhaps help with this mission?
Yeah, JPL is always open to collaborating with many different entities out there, and we do so on a lot of efforts along the way. And it's why we talk both at conferences and other places to find connections and such. So there's always latitude to explore partnerships and see what works best for any individual research effort.
Okay, and one other thing is that I had, you know, we have so many astronauts. When you train to be an astronaut, which I'm very excited for you, whether you go with NASA or to be a citizen astronaut, there's always the training in the submersible waters as an analog astronaut, which many of our public do not realize, that you must be trained underwater in the neutral buoyancy lab before taking a spacewalk or being out in the International Space Station. I feel we need more crew members for our ships, such as NOAA or OceanX, other research vessels, And we also need more individuals that know how to swim and dive. What do you say to this with our new next generation who is looking for something to explore?
There's the importance of swimming and diving in general out there, not only for healthy exercise, but just for safety along the way, that I would fully support there. And then as we go forward, these are environments that you can start to explore and investigate yourselves as citizen scientists before even going into more formal efforts as well. And absolutely, the astronauts that are out there and our training and neutral buoyancy lab have a long history of working with those areas there. And I have seen certainly in the news and in other places where there have been partnerships at times where our astronaut program has looked for analog environments and such on there. I think as we continue to develop opportunities for where we might have crewed operations along with robotic assets and such, NASA will continue to examine what would be best for training as they go into the future there.
Thank you very much, and best of luck to you for your candidacy. I really appreciate your speaking with us.
Absolutely.
John, Mr. Rudis, would you like to speak out? He entered a question in Q&A. John, your mic is enabled. You are welcome to unmute yourself. If not, he posed a question. Have you been working, or do you plan to work with the U.S. Navy and or Space Force?
What has been interesting, certainly with the Alvin dives, is that it is actually a U.S. naval vessel with Atlantis as well as Alvin. They're operated by Woods Hole. So UNOLS and the broader ocean community is very tied into the U.S. Navy, just as NASA is very connected with our launch opportunities to working with Space Force and Department of Defense and others on there. So it kind of, as we've talked on some of the previous questions here, NASA as a whole continues to collaborate and look for collaborations, not only within our own parts of the agency, but outside as well, to best achieve the mission objectives and serve our nation in terms of space exploration and exploration in general here.
Okay, there's another question. It said, can you say a few differences with ROV for oil and gas subsea application?
Could you repeat that?
Your ROV for oil and gas subsea, under the sea application.
Let me.
Yeah, take it.
Oh, okay. So the question was, speak to some of the uses of ROVs for oil and gas, the pipelines and such that are under the ocean on there. The oil and gas industry has been one of the leaders of ocean activity, commercial usage out there of these platforms, and does develop a lot of the technologies that are then used by the scientific community and vice versa along the way. Some of the things that you might use these ROVs for would be surveying various pipelines, looking for when there is a burst, such as was in the Gulf of Mexico or elsewhere on there, for what happened and for repair there. And I know Woods Hole has been tied into some of those over time as well.
Very good. Any question online? You can type in chat or click raise hand. Okay, if not, any question locally here? Okay, so let's thank Dr. Andy Klesh again. Really appreciate this wonderful talk. And on behalf of the AIAA Los Angeles Las Vegas section, we have a very nice appreciation certificate presented to Dr. Klesh. So here is our, let me ask some help for a picture. So yeah, or let me do this. Oh, hey, can you help take a picture? Yeah, for yes. So thank you, Andy. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Thank you. This is wonderful. Thank you. Can you take 1 second? Take a picture. Okay. Thank you.
We can just stop you guys. Very good. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Yeah, thank you. So you're welcome to stay here, and we have cookies on the back. We can brew another coffee. You're welcome. We have the room till 2. You're welcome to stay. And for folks online, if you want to stay, that's fine. Otherwise, we will close the online session. So our next event is 2 weeks from today in the Longdale Library. It's going to be very exciting because this year marks the 30th anniversary for discovering the famous comet Shoemaker-Levy 9. And we have a annual planetary defense mini conference that day. So we have speakers from Aerospace Corporation, University of Arizona, and different places. And one of the co-discoverer, Dr. Levy, he's going to speak online. He's the only remaining person for Shoemaker-Levy because the husband and wife, Mr. Shoemaker, Mrs. Shoemaker, they passed away. Mrs. Shoemaker passed away 2 years ago. We have an obituary in our newsletter. So Dr. Levy is the only remaining person for this famous discovery. And next year is the 30th anniversary for the collision onto Jupiter. So this year is going to be very exciting event. Actually, the event is very well known, and because of this, and hopefully you can join us. And also please consider, if you're not a member, please consider join us. And if you are a member, please stay with us and let me know what we can do for you. And we have more exciting event coming up. So please stay with us. So thank you so much again. Highly appreciate it. So have a wonderful day and weekend. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Sorry, Andy. Hi. Yes. So did you do engineering? Engineering. I just got into them about 5 years ago. So casting up with the volunteer program. So it's all on the EMC side. Yeah. Yeah, we do all of those really events. I do a lot of shit. With the fire station that we have out there. So that's fun. I mean, I've kind of done the route. I'm in the but I'm architect. And my grad but then firefighting for 1 year. Nice. Just wanted to put some program. Yeah, absolutely. We have a bunch that are now all over with everything from post going to medical school, some that want to go fire, and the one with volunteer experience. There's space sectors over there. Things all sorts of seats. Yeah. I just can't help think that I didn't architect mostly off the world habitat. Yeah. Yeah, I really do actually podcasts. Yeah. So he is this is vice president of okay. Talks but he is architect. And the mission formulation and so look about on it. I will. Yeah, that might be the good connection. Yeah, definitely. It is like I can't think of them. It's like that was part of